So let's talk through the Space Marine units that most commonly are viewed as a hindrance to their army list and not currently living up to the high standards demanded by the Astartes on the tabletop. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about weaker Space Marine units and what tend to be the issues that hold them back. A couple of weeks ago I made a video about certain units that tend to be auto-includes for the Space Marine army in one way or another. I'll leave that one linked down in the video description, but for this one I thought that we'd talk about the flip side a bit. Basically units in 10th edition that in the current set of game balance just don't really seem to make their way into basically any competitive Space Marine list, which perhaps tends to be a bit more telling than most given that they're not considered a strong faction in Warhammer 40k right now, and if they're not managing to make any headway even then, it implies that they just really are kind of weak by the standards of Warhammer 40k overall, and Games Workshop should probably do something to make them a bit more playable if they want to. Obviously I'm not trying to discourage people from making cool units work, it's really fun to see unusual things get used on the tabletop, and I feel like most of these could absolutely be fine in a list that was otherwise quite strong. But I feel like the more choices of these sort that you tend to include, the harder you're likely to make it for yourself, at least if the goal is trying to build the strongest Space Marine army list possible. For this one I've chosen 7 choices, then a few more honourable mentions after that. Let's talk through the squads and war machines, and why they very rarely get any sort of picks in competitive lists versus the massive amount of other options in Codex Space Marines. First up, let's start with one of the more obvious ones in the Primaris Reivers, since these guys come out with basically small arm sort of weapons, and in the lore largely being terror troops that might have an impact on enemy morale. That recipe seems to have been enough to make them one of the single weakest Space Marine units literally ever since they came out. Over the course of 7 years or so since their models were first released, it's actually kind of impressive that at no point during that there've really been any sort of strong units, occasionally getting a little bit more playable in one way or another, but still being kind of mid to bad at best. Unfortunately for them, that reputation really doesn't seem to have gone away in 10th edition. It's 85 points per 5 Reivers, so paying a bit more of a premium than a lot of other Space Marines out there like Intercessors or Incursors or Infernus Marines or Jump Intercessors. And for that you basically get the same standard Space Marine stat line, Strength 4, AP 0 and Damage 1 weapons, though they do get some precision attacks on those. The option to either deep strike with grav shoots or use their scout keyword and grapple launchers to jump to the tops of terrain. And then their leadership thing is an aura of -1 leadership, and engaged enemies must take a test in the fight phase, which could occasionally prevent a stratagem from going off or something. Unfortunately, as tends to be the case, this combo just still has them being viewed as directly inferior to a bunch of other Space Marine options. For the sort of cheap unit utility role, Jump Intercessors are just seen as far better. They're cheaper, they get native deep strike as well and actually have genuinely fairly serious damage output for their points cost. And when they're on the board they move far faster as well, which again is pretty great for bouncing around doing secondaries. For other on-the-board roles, all the rest of the squads have got some big selling points. Scouts and infiltrators often tend to be the interference units, Incursors might be able to mark things in gun lines, and Intercessors have their sticky objectives. For their own actual selling points, their precision attacks just tend to come up short given that most characters aren't going to die to Strength 4 AP 0 attacks, or at least not the ones that you really care about, like say Terminator characters, or anything with a toughness of 5 or more. And the leadership debuff occasionally could matter big, but it's just not reliably useful at all. They have to be right on the front line to make it work at all, and even then either be in melee with something that they might not survive too well against, or make sure that the enemy unit is damaged enough to take battle shock test, and it all seems just kind of specific and hard to coordinate for something that the enemy could just easily pass the leadership test anyway. As usual, it would just be cool if Games Workshop gave them something. I feel like you could certainly still make them work in like small units deep striking to do secondary objectives. I just think that they're directly inferior to Jump Intercessors for that role, never mind all the other choices that you have. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titan's Terrain, who have featured on the channel in the past to fairly good reception. Basically, they're just one of many options that you can get terrain on the tabletop with. The system that they offer is a bit different to most though. Basically you have a game board that's made out of 12 tiles, each of the tiles folds in half and you have a pop-up cardboard terrain structure on most of the tiles to create a little battlefield. The main advantages are that it's a lot cheaper than Games Workshop bought terrain. Price is perhaps fairly comparable with a battlefield full of MDF from cheaper providers, but also the fact that it's really quite portable, fitting in a box set that's about the same size as a normal board game, and that it all comes absolutely pre-made, no need to invest any hobby effort whatsoever as it's all pre-coloured and everything. Feel free to check them out in the link down in the video description if you want to see their range, otherwise I'll cycle back to them at the end of the video and just talk a little bit more about the pros, cons and specific things that they have on offer. But in any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring another video. Getting back to it though, and we're not quite done wailing on the poor Reivers just yet, as their unique character, the Reiver Lieutenant, seems to manage to be an even weirder and more rarely played version of the Reiver squad itself. He's 55 points and can only lead Reivers, which is a pretty bad start in itself, given that they're pretty niche in the first place, as we mentioned, compared with the many alternative marine infantry units, and even then they're typically a cheap utility unit, which it usually makes sense to field in minimum sized squads, as they aren't really your big damage dealers. For what he actually gives them, he has lethal hits, extends their terror range by an extra 3 inches, and then just only contributes a bunch more strength 4 AP 0 damage 1 precision attacks in melee. So basically nothing the squad didn't already do before really. On top of that, he also prevents the squad using deep strike, which is one of the selling points of Reivers in the first place, so it makes them even more niche than they would otherwise be, and that's just due to the miniature himself not coming with a grav chute. And between all that, it basically means that if you really want to lead Phobos units with a character of some sort, it's probably not Reivers, and the choice is likely the Phobos Lieutenant, who actually has a genuinely quite good boosted special rule with a move shoot move ability, which could allow you to at least get your spooky Skullmaster Space Marines to get a short charge out of reserves. He also comes with a grav chute as well and costs the same price, so there is that too. In general, this guy just really needs something to help him out and make him be the best choice for his own unique squad, as he's just ridiculous levels of niche, to the point where if you're fielding him it's probably just because you want to put the model on the board and you happen to have him in your collection. Moving on, fortifications rarely tend to be too successful for Warhammer armies these days, and the Marine Hammerfall Bunker is no exception. 175 points worth of adamantium that probably should have just been in tank form of one sort or another. It's a mobile and just sits on the board, unfortunately no deep strike as it sort of feels like it should be able to, it sort of vaguely feels like it's set up like a drop pod, and basically the one thing that it has going for it is good durability. 14 wounds at toughness 12 with a 2+ save is sturdy for 175 points, though beyond that there just isn't really too much that it does. Its damage output for the cost is just pretty bad, 2 shots at strength 10, AP 2 and damage d6 +1, or going frag mode, but only hitting on a 4+ because it's an automated bunker, and then either 2 twin heavy bolters, which isn't crazy in itself, or swap them out for 2d6 heavy flamer shots that are twin linked, which are definitely a bit more threatening, but also will only hit things at quite a short range. Its special rule is a free usage of Overwatch, which isn't terrible, but also isn't much. It's not like you get any particularly boosted Overwatch anymore, so you may be getting like 1 heavy bolter shot and a small chance at a missile hit. It's certainly a far cry from when you could have them fire Overwatch multiple times a turn, which did feel like a real selling point, and could see some success in slightly meme builds. Basically it's got okay defense, kind of bad damage, but being immobile and having objective control 0 are just absolutely killer in 10th edition Warhammer 40k. It can't move to gain any lines of sight, it can't help you out with the vast majority of secondary objectives, and it just means that there's multiple different tanks that would have done you far better. Perhaps for a similar sort of durability and price tag, you could look at the Repulsor for 180 points. It's covered in far more guns that hit more accurately, does some good transport utility, and most importantly can move around the table. Basically any of the other Space Marine battle tanks, lighter or heavier though, will probably do better than the Hammerfall Bunker unfortunately. In 10th edition it feels like Games Workshop's very unlikely to try and make this one too balanced. It just seems to be their game design that they don't want fortifications being in any way an optimal pick for any armies, and they just get nerfed whenever they do actually become kind of useful. Next up, for a unit that I basically just have never seen used in a successful competitive list in 10th edition, is the regular Astartes Dreadnought. I guess it's all about the Redemptor chassis these days, and this guy might have his days numbered with probably a finishing up of the Firstborn phase out in 11th edition, but it's maybe a bit of a shame that he doesn't have a slightly scarier datasheet for the rest of 10th. It's 135 points, so a cheapish vehicle, but doesn't really have a massive amount of durability for that cost. 8 wounds at toughness 9 with a 2+ save is alright, but anything high AP will make very short work of him. The lowish toughness can be a bit bad against certain weapon profiles like melter guns. For its damage, it's just not really too standout here. The melee weapon is probably the best thing, with 5 attacks at strength 12, AP 2 and damage 3. Could certainly worry some lighter vehicles or heavy infantry, but his problem is that with a 6-inch move he's just kind of unlikely to get that into anything your opponent cares about too much, so he's maybe just banking on being ignored, And if that were the case, I feel like it's usually a sign that you should have picked something more threatening. Beyond that, the range damage is a little bit token compared with things like the Redemptor and all the rest of those class Dreadnoughts, which are kind of covered in guns. And if you want a dedicated gun turret Dreadnought, then the Ballistus is 140 points and comes with inbuilt rerolls and more las cannon shots, even if you field it in the dual ranged weapon setting. In reality, I think the only real selling point for this one is that he comes with at least a somewhat interesting reroll 1's aura for infantry nearby, which I feel isn't too terrible on paper, but in reality just very rarely fits in with competitive 40k lists these days. It's quite a lot more useful and easy to use with ranged units over melee, and means that you kind of need to take a whole bunch of heavy hitting ranged units of one sort or another. If you're going for a list that say got multiple big squads of 10 Hellblasters or something, then perhaps that's enough. But even if that were the case, I sort of feel like if you've got that kind of firebase going on, you probably want to use Oath of Moment to make it better anyway, so quite a few times this guy's rerolls buff might just be a bit redundant. In general though, that just rarely seems to be the way that Space Marines tend to play these days. They're more about fast hard-hitting units jumping in quickly and then dealing some big damage, but maybe not being too hard to hit back in return. Maybe a bit more so than massive gun lines full of loads of things just standing in the open, giving and taking blows. Overall, I feel like his rules are genuinely interesting enough to see play, but I just think he needs to be really quite a lot fewer points. Maybe start by dropping him down to something more like 115 points, somewhere in that sort of realm, and maybe people might be able to find a bit more use for him. Next up on the overshadowed datasheet front is the standard Space Marine Ancient. Just feeling like one of the models that very few people are going to take just because of how much he offers for his points cost versus the big competition from all the other Space Marine characters that you could add. For the 50 points, the regular Ancient gets you +1 objective control for the unit, which does also help out against Battle Shock there, so it means that if your squad's Battle Shocked, they still remain on 1 OC. He has a power weapon with a few attacks to chip in melee, and then a 4 wound character with a 4+ feel no pain whether he's standing on objectives or in the centre of the board. I guess that means he's a little bit unusually hard to gun down once his entire squad's been taken down. On average, you would have to slog through around about 8 wounds of Space Marine to destroy him. The main issue with the Ancient is that objective control isn't nothing, but it just isn't reliably good. If you're adding him to one of the troops equivalent units, they already have quite good objective control with OC2 each. Certain ranged elites like Stern Guard or Hellblasters might wind up to be a little bit less likely having a big fight in the middle of the board. And if you've got high value elites like that, you're often better off just going with one of the characters that's going to help them out with, say, free stratagems or damage or defense, like lieutenants or even things like librarians or apothecaries. And even if you do have a contested objective, the enemy might still out-OC you if you've taken a bunch of casualties, or you might have won the objective control game anyway, even if the Ancient wasn't present. It just feels like most of the time you're going to trade something that's got reliable good value, say damage and defense, or other cool utility for something that only comes up every so often. And I feel like one of the units that most gets on well with Ancients and the extra objective control are Blade Guard, but they also get their own unique one, so don't use the regular Ancient datasheet. He has his issues, but is even cheaper and gives you a one-time damage boost, which I think doesn't hurt overall. For characters to compare to, maybe the standard Lieutenant might be the most obvious one at 65 points, not really all that much more investment, and a character that could double up in a unit as well with a captain. The lethal hits just makes the vast majority of Space Marine squads far more dangerous. Fall back and shoot and charge is good utility, and an actual OK melee profile with a power fist definitely doesn't hurt either. I feel like I'd only be tempted by the standard Ancient if you had a really specific need, like trying to use an enhancement that's only available on an Ancient, or trying to do some sort of weird double up with a Lieutenant and another enhancement in a unit. I just feel like the overall value beyond that just isn't really all that much. I've basically never seen him in any sort of competitive list that have done well in 10th edition so far. Next up for overshadowed vehicles, we're on to flyers now, and for these ones I'd talk about the Stormhawk and Stormtalon. I'll cut the Storm Raven a bit of flack in this one for its combo with the Dark Shroud and Ironstorm Spearhead, even if that isn't as good as it used to be. The smaller Storm planes though are 155 points and 165 points respectively, and they do have some advantages as flyers. If you use the Stormtalon in the hover mode, then you move a big 20 inches. If you use them in aircraft mode, then they can be good for a beta strike, where they come in from reserves and hit things hard, ignoring obscuring terrain, and then get good movement, although that does come with the downsides of OC0 and the locked flight mode in the fixed flight mode. I feel like they're really not too far from having a fair bit more utility, but at their current points cost I feel like it's their damage and defense that really doesn't do too well for the points cost they have. 10 wounds at either toughness 8 or toughness 9 with a 3+ save is just very easy to take down for that kind of price tag. worse than things like gladiators, never mind things like dreadnoughts or more stompy on the ground things, and the damage output doesn't really make up for it either. I'd say the Stormhawk Swarm is kind of okay, the Stormtalon's just kind of bad with only 2 guns, even if they're fun twin-linked ones. I think just overall both planes pay far too much a premium for their speed and mobility, which does have its downsides as well as upsides. I feel like if you are trying to make these work, they're probably less of a hindrance than most, just going to be slightly underwhelming damage dealers and require the rest of the army to carry them a bit, but it just seems that the vast majority of other vehicle damage dealers will add more to the force. Finally, for the main units, I thought we'd mention the Primaris Desolation Squad, the guys who like to put missile launchers on their missile launchers. The model's having a really rocky reception with fans, but both in late 9th edition and early 10th edition, the indirect fire with the Castellan launchers and the Vengor launcher wound up making them just to be incredibly competitive units, very scary and capable of wiping out a bunch of things that they can't see, leading Games Workshop in 10th edition to hand out some massive nerfs to them early on in 10th edition, restricting the squad size to 5 of them and bumping up the points cost to a ridiculous 40 points per model, and they've never been seen in any sort of optimised Space Marine list since. They're just ridiculously fragile at 40 points per body, so you can't really afford to have them stand in the open and use their direct fire missile launchers, not without expecting them to get shot down straight after. And then even if they are firing on absolute full capacity, 4 supercrack rockets at the strength 10, AP2 and damage D6+1, and then a bunch of blasts with 4 sort of bolter shot kind of blasts with the Castellan launchers, and then the more general purpose Vengor launcher. I think it only really gets their damage output into sort of so-so territory, particularly given that the indirect fire nerf hit these guys quite badly. They can now only hit on a 4+ when they're firing indirect, and the way that it's worded, their special rule doesn't ignore that, it only ignores the modifiers bit of it, not the direct setting of indirect weapons to hit on a 4+, no better. Overall, I do feel like they are going to be quite a hard unit to balance, even if Games Workshop wanted to, but it seems to be their logic at the moment that they're just going to keep indirect fire units pretty niche, and that means that these guys just don't really have all that much of a good outlook for the future. In any case, that's the main list that I wanted to talk about. There's maybe a whole bunch of things that I might have talked about as honourable mentions, and I could have been harsh to a few other units and included them here as well. The Stormspeeder Hail Strike and Stormspeeder Hammer Strike just feel a bit on the niche side, not really all that much damage output, and their debuff rules are the things to sell them. They're quite pricey for things that don't give you quite as meaningful a debuff thing as the big +1 to wound against vehicles that the Thunderstrike gets though. To me that just feels like that's going to overshadow them against the vast majority of armies, unless you happen to know that you're playing against heavy infantry or something. The Firestrike Servo Turret has basically just been a bit overcosted for what it does since the start of the edition. Its direct damage output isn't bad, but it basically does that direct damage while being far slower and far easier to kill compared with tanks and vehicles, so in general people just take things like the Gladiator tanks or the various other damage dealers instead. Tactical squads, despite being the cheapest Space Marines at 140 points, still feel a bit clunky and harder to use than most. There's just not a huge amount of attraction to them, besides being cheap bodies and getting one big single heavy weapon like a las cannon or multi-melter. I feel like one unit where maybe you get some basic guys to camp the home field objective and then have the more dangerous ones move forward could be fine. That's presuming you don't have other things that you want to hold the home field like infiltrators and their denied deep strike though. Otherwise, the Invicta Tactical Warsuit basically pays a big premium for its scout move. Its damage output isn't awful, but it's kind of easy to kill. The Invader ATV just doesn't have amazing damage or defense for the cost, though it's a fairly cheap unit in its own right that's fairly fast, could be okay for trading, though again I've not seen loads of people use them in any sort of optimized list. Cato Sicarius feels like he drew the short straw for Ultramarines datasheets. He gives scouts assault and a reactive move, all of which can potentially be helpful, but perhaps often less so compared with direct damage style things. Just feels like he's often going to be the last Ultramarines character that people are going to look at. And finally, not directly in the codex, but the Thunderhawk gunship maybe should have a shout out to. A really big and cool Forge World iconic hunk of resin, but just really costs far too much for what it does as a big centerpiece model. It does have some heavy firepower, but pays too many points for it. In any case, I'll certainly be interested to hear what you guys have to say about these. Have you been putting any of these on the table in 10th edition so far? And if so, have you managed to make them work? Look forward to hearing all your ideas on them. In any case though, I'll cycle back to the video sponsor in Titan's Terrain now, and just talk through a few more bits about their fun unfolding cardboard battlefield terrain system. As mentioned earlier, the biggest advantages of it are that it's really easy to store and transport due to its folding system. It's far cheaper than a whole board of Games Workshop terrain, though to be fair that is the same of a lot of things, perhaps somewhat comparable to MDF, though unlike the vast majority of terrain that you can buy out there, it doesn't need any painting or assembly for people who want to preserve their hobby effort for their main armies. It's ready to go immediately. I think between all that, there's enough there that it's the right choice for some people out there, though other people might prefer other things. For the main downsides, it can be a little bit less sturdy and hard wearing versus plastic or MDF, given it is made of cardboard. You do need to look after it a little bit more than most, and being designed to fold flat, you might have a little bit more trouble positioning models in the upper stories, as it can just be a tiny bit more unstable. The grid layouts can mean that it's a little bit less flexible than some terrain sets, though it's very easy to help that quite a lot just by one or two standard bits of terrain thrown in with the rest. It certainly doesn't make things like tournament approved terrain layouts if that's what you're looking for, but I feel like it does a good job of making really quite a nice looking battlefield really quite quickly and without hobby effort. These guys have got 3 main sets of it. First up, this Forgotten Furnace one, which is basically a heretical Chaos style industrial sector, some nice glowing runes carved into the floor there, and a bunch of factory style ruins. The price on these at the moment is £112, $140 or €131, and the link's down in the video description. As you can see, it's basically a 12 grid of tiles, 2 blank ones and the rest being their buildings, and they come together in a board the right size for 2000.40k. Then beyond that, they've got one called a Shattered Hive one, maybe a bit more of a traditional ruined city type thing, a lot more slate grey ruins there, and a few armoured containers. And then the last one is an overgrown capital, a few more fantasy style ruins here, though I still think that it's pretty appropriate for futuristic warfare too. It might just be one that's a little bit more appropriate for using in either fantasy or 40k style settings, as opposed to just one. Each of those sets also have the option for an expansion bit as well, basically 2 tiles smashed together to make one enormous building of one sort or another. The Capital one and the Shattered Hive ones both have a sort of ruined cathedral type thing, and the Forgotten Furnace one has a great big spire. In any case, a big thank you to Titans Terrain for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description. Definitely an option that could be right for some people. Plenty of other good choices for terrain exist as well, like MDF 3D printed or other stuff of course. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one for the Space Marines. Feel free to check out the sort of strong units and auto-includes for certain detachments and armies. I'll leave that one linked down in the video description. Otherwise, feel free to check out all the other bits down there. The channel does have a Patreon page to help support it. There's links to a whole bunch of Warhammer 40k discount retailers, and a few other things besides. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.